Ça vous va tous les trois.
Amnesty versus
Paper.
Just there.
Do you need paper? Remember, when you leave, you have to take everything back with you. Also, Mr. Speaker.
Eh bien, bonjour et bienvenue à ces premiers quarts de finale des Jeux du commerce 2020. Dans un premier temps et avant de commencer, j'aimerais tout simplement aviser l'audience de la nécessité de ne pas tenter d'influencer de quelque façon que ce soit les gens en débat présentement. Je rappelle qu'il faut éteindre ces cellulaires, non pas les mettre sur mode vibe, mais les éteindre totalement afin de ne pas déranger les participants. Alors, pour les premiers quarts de finale, à notre droite, nous avons le gouvernement. À notre gauche, l'opposition.
Did you all understand what he said?
Ah, c'est vrai, oui. Okay. Est-ce qu'on peut avoir le nom les numéros des équipes?
207.
Alors, je vais demander avant de discuter justement aux membres du jury de se présenter.
Francis Bergeron, je suis correspondant à l'Assemblée nationale pour la presse canadienne. Peter Bondard, je suis consultant en développement international.
Maxime Nouvet, je suis consultant en affaires publiques.
Laurence Auger, gestionnaire de temps.
Patrice Bourbonnet, représentant médical.
Massimo Pacetti, ancien député de fédéral de Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel.
Alors, Fortin, consultant et chroniqueur politique dans les médias.
Alors, sans plus attendre, j'appellerai, I would call the Prime Minister of the government to stand.
Est-ce qu'on peut soigner le microphone? Je pense que non. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. The resolution that we are gathering here to discuss and support on behalf of the government is be it resolved that the governments of Canada suspend the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement. We don't think that this is a complicated model. We would take the existing agreement in place and remove it, essentially allowing for the free passage of migrants from the United States to Canada, regardless of entry point. So we would not block off any migrants from the U.S. Should migrants arrive in the U.S. before actually arriving in Canada. We would not consider the U.S. as being a proper final end destination point if the migrant's wish is to ultimately end up in Canada. We would allow entry points available to those migrants. We have 4 arguments for you on behalf of the government today, 3 of which I'll cover in my own speech. The first one is on refugee and migrant safety. The second one is being about the well-being, mental and motivational of those refugees or migrants. And the final point that I'll bring to you today is countering populism, while my partner will bring up our final point of the economic benefits reaped to Canada. So on to our first point about migrant safety. We think the United States right now as it is not the safest nation and not the safest end destination for migrants seeking asylum for potential conflict areas. We see the culture within the United States, at least in certain parts of the country, are highly anti-immigration and anti-refugee, sometimes leading to points of violence and violent protest, right? We see that in the US, there have been riots and revolts such as Charlottetown, literally regarding like neo-Nazis protesting for right-wing values and sometimes actively threatening the lives of immigrants and of migrants. So we think that in a world in which that occurs, the United States is not a good final safe destination for these migrants, that migrants need to be afforded the utmost opportunity to be able to go to Canada and seek a new life. We do not view the U.S. as it stands to be a good final destination destination for these migrants. We do not think that these migrants will establish themselves in a new and safe lifestyle. We think that that happens in Canada, which is why we should not consider the U.S. as being a legitimate final destination for the migrants should they ultimately wish to be moving to Canada as their end destination or over the course of their conflict. Our second point is about the well-being of migrants and about how important it is that migrants end up in their supposed end destination. We think that when a migrant is in a region, like in an intermediary country, that they do not want to be their final their end destination along their migrant path. What ultimately happens is they live off worse lives from a mental health perspective within those countries. We said they feel less at ease, and they feel like we feel like they are less at ease, like they are less able to start new lives and become active members of the citizenry of those countries. They are less productive and they are less beneficial to the host country. We think that in Canada, that's where migrants ultimately would feel most at ease if that is their final, if that's their end destination, and where migrants will live out the best years of their lives until they go back to their actual home country. We think that migrants will have the best mental well-being within Canada, and we think that that's an important factor to consider, not just the benefits of Canada, because Canada is a nation that values migrants globally and respects the ability for individuals to seek asylum. We believe that Canada and the government of Canada also needs to make policy decisions that end up maximizing the well-being of migrants within reason. Our final point from this speech today is about countering populism. So we think that there are a lot of leaders and leaders within the world today that are very right-wing and very counterproductive for the global community because of the fact that there's been a legitimacy of populism from Western nations, such as the United States with the election of like Donald Trump. We think that by allowing for this populism to occur, you get leaders like President Duterte in the Philippines and very scary leaders in like Brazil and Turkey who end up causing like progressive thinking, like end up spouting global racism and global hate, end up being like very counterintuitive in terms of like climate change, because of the fact that the United States has propped forward like a very populist kind of leader. We think that this is relevant to this motion because we think that when Canada takes a stance within the global community, we think that when Canada says that we think that migrants and progressive mindedness with respect to migrants is important, you set a precedent that counters the populist movement globally, that sets a precedent from a Western liberal democracy that populism is not acceptable in most situations, and that therefore we have more and more of these leaders who are counterproductive to the global system, who leave the global system and hopefully create a better place, a better global economy and global community. Thank you for your time.
I would call a leader of the opposition, please, for a period of 5 minutes.
Sorry, I just have a quick question. For the timing, it's 5 minutes timing, but there is a grace period at the end, correct? That isn't subject to penalty?
No. If it's what?
So after the 5 minutes are allotted, there is a period of 15 seconds at the end in which there is no penalty. Perfect, just making sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Esteemed judges, side government, esteemed colleagues, be it resolved that the Government of Canada suspends the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement. Allow me to repeat. Be it resolved that the Government of Canada suspends the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement. This means that the Government of Canada intends on suspending the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement. This means that the amount of refugees that are flooding into the country is not properly processed and not properly regulated, and we and side government needed to step up and suspend the issue in order for it to be properly processed. Today, I will bring forth 4 arguments explaining why we are against the idea of suspending the amount of refugees coming into the country. 3 of which will be developed by, 2 of which will be developed by myself, 1 of which will be developed by my colleagues. First argument is that the current diplomatic relationships with the USA has just recently heightened. The second argument is that the refugee system is heavily overcharged. The third argument developed by my colleague is that we must stand by our Canadian reputation. And our fourth argument, once again developed by my other colleague, is that short-sighted thinking will cause long-term problems. Now, thanks to government's implementation, there seems to be a conflict in understanding of the motion. However, we will stick to bringing forth the arguments of being the opposition of suspending the Canada-US safe third country agreement. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand that the current diplomatic relationships with the USA has just recently heightened. Just as recently as January 3rd, America has assassinated a very pertinent Iranian leader due to some accusations because of terrorism that has heightened intensively the amount of diplomatic relationships between U.S. and other countries. This is starting to bring forth a large amount of heightened tensions and heightened complications, of which can cause a long-term detrimental effect. We need to understand that the Safe Third Country Agreement, as it stands, the system that it has, means that any refugees or any person that is trying to come to Canada or to the U.S. for a safe road, Canada will at this point be able to accept. They have a very low standard, relatively, of allowing refugees to enter into the country and gain their refugee status. And the barriers and requirements to obtain a refugee status, as it stands, is currently has some flaws. This brings us to our second argument. The refugee system is heavily processed. This means that our system currently at any entry points within southern Quebec is currently flooded with refugees currently trying to enter the country. Now, these refugees could be people who are trying to enter out of safety. However, side opposition argues that this takes a lot of time to process. The amount of people that are waiting at our borders, at our southern borders within Quebec, entering our country, is the amount of refugees that are entering within our border, within our country, requires a lot of processing time and requires a lot of complication and brings forth a lot of complications. We are not fully able to make the distinction between people who are legitimately requiring a refugee status and people who are taking advantage of the system and just trying to seek refuge within Canada without fully being in country, without fully being in danger in the country at home. Now, to bring forth some important facts, according to CTV News, in December 31st of 2019, the United States is considered one of the top countries in the world, one of the top most powerful countries in the world, starting to sever these ties between no longer processing or allowing the United States to allow these countries in can lead to a detrimental effect. Overall, we need to realize that the relationship that we need to have with the United States still needs to remain strong, and suspending the Canada's U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement could cause more detrimental effects than positive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would call the first representative of the government, please, for a period of 3 minutes.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, members of opposition, and colleagues. So, we've already mentioned 3 main points, including safety, well-being, and populism, as to why we do think that suspending this motion would be an excellent idea. And I'll be now presenting our 4th argument, which is the economic benefit for Canada. So essentially, immigrants are some of the largest contributing members of the Canadian labour force and the Canadian economy, and are essential to our economy. In fact, half of Toronto, and Toronto is honestly the economic engine of Canada, were born outside of Canada. And jobs created in Toronto in recent years have been more than Seattle and San Francisco combined. So we are seeing huge GDP growth, huge population growth, GDP growth per capita, income growth for all of Canada as a whole. The middle class is seeing the benefits are, upper class are seeing the benefits of as well, and as well as these immigrants that we're allowing in. And what we're not sure that opposition clearly understood, but that we are trying to put forward, is that suspending this agreement is not in turn stopping us from accepting immigrants. It's that right now, with the Canadian-US third country rule, it means that if coming through US first as an immigrant, which many immigrants have to do considering the geography of US and Canada, that they must apply for asylum in the US before they can even attempt to seek shelter in Canada. And this is the issue, and the heart of the issue here is that the people that are seeking asylum in US and then are then getting stuck in the US, even when their end goal is to be in Canada, are not where they need to be and are in a place that is obviously fostering horrible tensions, horrible relations. And that's why it's so important that with these immigrants getting where they need to be, we as Canadian citizens and immigrants are seeing the economic benefits of them getting where they need to go. Them being remained in the USA has nothing to do with how we're going to grow as a country and how we can continue to grow economically. So I'll now be combating the first point that opposition made, which is about the diplomatic relations with the USA. So we're talking about these heightened tensions with the US that we've recently seen. And the assassination of the recent Iranian important figure was brought up, which I'm not really sure the relevance of this in terms of the motion, in terms of how it's affecting the Canada-US third country rule, but I'll continue by just saying that what's so important about these diplomatic relations is that, yes, we will always have the US as an ally, and it's extremely important that we maintain them as an ally. But it's also important that we maintain our Canadian integrity and our Canadian values. And at the end of the day, what's essential is that Canada takes this step that we know is who we are as a country, and we do value fostering peace, we value fostering community, and we value accepting all migrants and all people and the well-being of citizens across the world, and not just in our own country. So we're saying by suspending this, we're not saying that we are against the United States. We're saying that we disagree with the way that migrants are being treated, and that by suspending this rule, we would be able to accept them in our own terms, in our own way, without them being caught in the place where they are now. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I welcome to the stand the first representative of the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will begin my speech by going over our third point, which Canada stands by our reputation, followed by going into rebuts of government's points. So first, our third point states that we stand by our Canadian reputation. Canada has the reputation of being kind, helpful, as well as welcoming whether it's refugees or other immigrants with opening arms. We want to help them, we want to aid them. By suspending the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement, we are sending the wrong message to the US, as well as our Canadian current citizens and potentially future ones, as well as those who are refugees and immigrants who do have Canadian status, for example. So therefore, we are opening the potential to backlash from those countries, which can create a detrimental issue for future. Now I will go into the rebuts. Government states that the U.S. is not a safe destination for refugees. However, it is the top country according to the power country. Therefore, by simply stating that the States is not a safe end destination, it is overlooking the realities behind the presidents in the United States. Secondly, they also state that we need to make policy decisions as well as changes. We agree. But by instilling and imposing this motion, we will be hurting immigrants more than helping them. Government puts down the American president, but despite personal political beliefs, we do share borders and we have to acknowledge these facts. And we cannot ridicule our presidents as well as our neighbors by instilling this motion as well as ridiculing them through their own personal beliefs. We need to instead empower each other, help each other, and unite as one to help said refugees and potential Canadian citizens as well as immigrants. That is why it is important to stand together and aid those potential citizens and refugees. They also talk about the economic benefit. Immigrants do impose an economic benefit for Canadians as we are a growing country. Baby boomers are getting older. And these immigrants, they do have an education. They could potentially surpass and to help our economic growth and our Canadian environment to get better. So by stating that there is an economic benefit, we agree. However, the way they have defined it does not impose and does not aid the motion. They are surpassing the motion as it doesn't seem that they actually understand what they are imposing. So therefore, I would like to reiterate and strengthen our third point as we are a Canadian, we are Canada, and we do want to stand by our reputation as we want other countries to come in here happy as we do welcome them with open arms. Thank you.
I would now call to stand the second representative of the government for a period of 4 minutes.
So for my speech today, we're gonna finish off the refutation of arguments 2 and 3 that the opposition brought forward, and just continue on with a reconstruction of our arguments that we do not believe the opposition has addressed properly. So argument number 2 from the opposition was that the refugee system was simply overcharged and it would be very, very costly in terms of resources and in terms of human capital to tackle this issue. The government does not believe that this is the proper way to go about solving this issue. Yes, it is true that it is costing a lot of human capital, a lot of money to control our borders, to treat all these applications. However, we believe that potential refugees can bring a very high return on investment. We could see this as an investment on future Canadians, and that there's going to be a huge payoff at the end of the day. The opposition also mentioned that we would not be able to properly discern who is a proper refugee from who is not. And even though it is possible that we may accept refugees that shouldn't have been accepted, we believe that we should accept refugees in a greater context, and that the lives of those legitimate refugees are worth the allowance of a few illegitimate ones. The third argument that the opposition brought was about Canadian reputation, and more specifically in relation to the US. However, we believe that we should expand our horizon and think of the Canadian reputation in an international context, and think of all the countries that have condoned the Safe Third Country Agreement, and think of all the implications from individuals from these countries in Latin America and Africa who suffer and continue to suffer every day from this unfair agreement. Now, I'm going to reconstruct the arguments that we brought forward and that I do not believe were addressed properly by the opposition. The opposition has not shown how the status quo is better. We believe that it is unacceptable because it threatens the lives of refugees and their well-being. And the opposition has simply not shown how the status quo is better in these two aspects. We believe that migrants are much, much better off without this agreement because they are able to travel to Canada in a safe way, and they are able to stay in a country where the citizens are not as hateful in certain contexts. We also believe that in the context of a refugee that is able to stay in a country where he or she is welcomed by the citizens of this country, and where and where he or she wants to live in, that citizen is going to feel a lot more motivated to be a good contributing member of society, and that everybody benefits from this, US and Canada, right? Because the US would not want to be having these migrants who would not want to be here, and we want those migrants who want to be here. And we have, and data show that thousands of refugees have tried to come to Canada for a better life. And this leads to our third point about our fourth point about economic development. There are thousands of migrants that have migrated in the past year, and we believe that these migrants could drive the economic growth of the country, and that we are all going to benefit. And it is for all these points that we think that we should suspend the agreement. Thank you.
I would welcome to the stand a second representative of the opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To reiterate the motion, be it resolved that the Government of Canada suspends the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement. I will begin by reiterating the arguments. I will elaborate on our fourth one. And finally, I will rebut. So to reiterate the arguments placed by my colleagues. Number one, maintain positive relations with the US. Number two, Number two, strengthen our system. Number three, stand by our reputation. And number four, which I will elaborate, short-sighted thinking will cause long-term problems. So every motion is set in place because there is a problem that needs to be solved. Currently, there are way too many people from the US that want to go to Canada because of the fear that they have of living in the United States. And this has caused a problem because it's creating an influx of people in the borders of Canada. That is a problem that is trying to be solved with this motion by suspending the agreement. Now, again, we must think not only only think on the short term, but in the long term as well. Currently, there are a lot of tensions going on with the states. And so people fear that, and they want to move away, and so they try to move to Canada. That is happening now, but there is a backlash if we suspend this. Why? Because in the long term, when, let's say, Canadians fear for their life, where will they go? We must think in the long term as well. We want the US to be on our side because the US is a very powerful ally, as mentioned by my previous colleagues. Side government keeps on mentioning the importance of immigrants, and we agree that immigrants are very important. We receive, on average, 250,000 immigrants per year. We believe that this motion is just solving the problem short term, but it's creating a ripple effect that will cause harm for us in the long term. To begin our refutations, side government, again, is mentioning the positive on immigrants, and we agree that immigrants are a positive contribution to our country. But that is not what the motion is about. More than 50% of immigrants have a higher than a college education, according to CTV. We know this is a very valuable asset that we get from immigrants, but to solve the problem, there are so many different alternatives rather than just suspending and dealing with the ripples that this suspension creates. Alternatives such as harder regulation on who exactly crosses the border. By suspending it, we're not only sending a message that could be negative and creating backlash from the states, but creating, again, mentioning, creating a message towards other countries and how they react to the suspension of this agreement. Another point that SAD government mentioned is the well-being of the United States citizens and how they're struggling with it. They have not proven that citizens in the United States are suffering by their well-being, and so the only solution is to come to Canada. Again, they are bringing forth arguments that aren't for this motion. They have not proved why this motion is valuable. We believe in the safety of our Canadians, but we believe in opening our arms, but with proper regulation. Thank you very much.
Now for the closing argument, I invite the Prime Minister for a period of 3 minutes.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'll begin my speech by doing a reconstruction of some of the arguments brought forward by, I'm sorry, I don't think the timer is going down yet. I don't think the time has started.
Sure.
I'll reset.
Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I'd first like to begin my speech by doing a reconstruction of some of the arguments constructively that have been brought forward by side government, and then do a final rebuttal of the arguments seen by side opposition. First, I'd just like to mention that the ultimate safety of these migrants, our very first argument, has not been discussed whatsoever by the opposition case. They never gave any kind of reputational argumentation about why the safety of these refugees or of these migrants are not of the utmost importance. Therefore, we believe that this point surely stands. Second point that I brought forward, or the government brought forward, is the well-being of migrants. The previous speaker we believe the previous speaker misconstrued that argumentation, that analysis, by saying that the point was regarding the well-being of U.S. citizens. We like to say that is not relevant, that is not an accurate depiction of the point that was discussed. We were talking about how the well-being of migrants, insofar as they have good as they're able to plant strong roots in their destination countries, are important, which is not relevant to the rebuttal that they brought forward. But I'd quickly like to do a refutation of some arguments that we've seen from side opposition. I'd first like to clarify that the first argument brought forward by side opposition is high diplomatic tension between the United States and Canada. Their third point was that the U.S., as a result of these diplomatic tensions, will create backlash on Canadians. And their fourth point was short-sightedness can harm the relationship between the U.S. and Canada, leading to backlash. So I'd like to point out to the honourable panel that these points are suspiciously similar, and we do not think that they qualify as new argumentation or new points, but I will nonetheless refute them as if they are. I'd like to move on to their fourth and final point, that being short-sighted thinking. They mention how jeopardizing the U.S.-Canadian relationship has a potential to harm the advantages that we reap with the U.S. into the future. We like to talk about why it won't harm the U.S. relationship. Right now, the U.S. foreign policy is to minimize the amount of migrants that they accept, to minimize the amount of refugees that are within their system. That's the defining policy of the current administration. We believe that by suspending the Canada-U.S. third country agreement, we actually create a system that takes migrants and refugees from the United States and processes them through the Canadian system. Therefore, we believe that we are actually providing a service with respect to what the U.S. foreign policy on the issue actually is. So we don't see the opposition's argumentation that there will be a strained relationship as being entirely legitimate, because we think that the relationship might actually improve. Furthermore, with respect to their backlash points about how we need to appease the United States, we think that appeasing the United States at the expense of Canada's own foreign policy and Canada's own integrity ultimately shows that Canada isn't its own legitimate country that makes its own decisions. Canada is simply a puppet of the United States that makes foreign policy decisions in order to appease our neighbors south of the border. We do not think that that is the most legitimate view of Canada, and I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you, Honourable Speaker and panel.
I invite the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. I will conclude this debate by refuting some of side government's arguments, followed by bringing the debate down to a conclusion. Side government's first argument of refugee migrant safety. Say we implement this motion under their misunderstanding. How is Canada going to be able to handle this influx of new migrants? How is Canada going to be able to process successfully this new influx of refugees that are coming into the border? As it stands, our country's entry ports in the southeast have seen a large influx of new refugees that are seeking asylum within Canada. Side government has failed to mention how exactly are we going to improve the system that we have currently by bringing this motion to pass. Their claim of just having a service that will improve something without bringing forth any reasonable jurisdiction doesn't bring forth the burden of proof to side opposition. Overall, side government says that suspending the Safe Third Country Act by not considering the U.S. as a second country simply doesn't remedy the core issue. Government claims that suspending the Third Country Agreement will mean all refugees and immigrants are just immediately going to come to Canada instead of the U.S. And this simply isn't the case logistically. This agreement, the Safe Third Country Act, helps immigrants and refugees seek asylum in both the U.S. and in Canada. It's not government's jurisdiction to decide whether or not the USA accepts refugees. The government claims that refugee and migrant safety, by limiting the ability to seek refuge or immigrate into Canada, they want to care about the well-being of these immigrants and these refugees. And there's no causal link between living in Canada and having a mental well-being. In fact, we're experiencing a mental health crisis right now. So I don't quite understand what points that the side government was trying to prove by bringing that forward. To reiterate our 4 points, we need to understand that if we were to truly suspend the Canada-US Safe Third Country Act, we have heightened tensions between the U.S. and the rest of the world. We have increasing amounts of migrants that are flowing within our country, and we need to maintain our reputation as a national leader. We've been able to successfully build our reputation as Canada through immigrants and through multiculturalism. Making the claim that suspending this act without bringing forth any effective possible solution simply doesn't allow side government to think that they want this debate in any form. Judges, Mr. President, thank you very much.
Merci.